The mystery of the vanished lake. Elliot had spent his entire life surrounded by the serene beauty of Silver Lake. The vast expanse of water shimmered in the sunlight and mirrored the surrounding forest and mountain peaks. It was more than just a lake. It was the heart of the community, a symbol of stability and life. Every morning, Elliot hiked to a nearby ridge to enjoy the view, a personal ritual that centered him. But on this particular morning, something was profoundly different. The air felt heavier, charged, as if a thunderstorm were brewing. When Elliot reached the ridge, he paused, confused. The usual sight of Silver Lake glistening in the dawn was gone. Instead, what lay before him was a massive, gaping crater, jagged and dry. The lake, in all its grandeur, had vanished. Elliot rubbed his eyes and scanned the horizon, half expecting to see the water relocated somewhere else, as if it had spilled out like a toppled glass. But there was nothing. Not even a puddle remained. Panic began to rise in his chest. Had an earthquake drained the lake? A sinkhole? He knelt and ran his fingers over the dry, cracked earth at the edge of the crater. It felt unnaturally warm, as though the ground had been scorched. "This can't be real," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the eerie silence. He pulled out his phone, hoping for a signal to call someone, anyone, but the reception was dead. Frustrated, he took a series of photos and videos of the scene before descending the ridge. His mind buzzed with questions. How could a lake disappear overnight? Why hadn't anyone else noticed? Was he losing his mind? By the time he reached the small town of Glenwood, where he lived, the atmosphere was already tense. People milled about, their faces painted with disbelief and worry. It was clear Elliot wasn't the only one who had noticed the disappearance. "Did you see it?" Mrs. Callahan, the elderly florist, clutched his arm as he passed. "The lake, it's gone!" "I saw it," Elliot replied, still catching his breath. "What happened? Did anyone hear anything last night?" "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "Not a sound. It's like it just evaporated." Elliot continued down Main Street to the local community center, where a group of townsfolk had gathered. Murmurs filled the air, a mix of speculation and fear. "It must be some kind of geological event," suggested Mr. Harlow, the retired science teacher. "A collapse in the Earth's crust, perhaps." "Geological? What about those lights we saw in the sky last night?" countered a younger man. "I thought it was the aurora, but now," Elliot's ears perked up. "Lights? What kind of lights?" "Strange ones," the man said. "Pulsing, almost like they were alive. They moved across the lake and then disappeared." This revelation only deepened Elliot's unease. He decided he needed answers, real answers. Theories from the townsfolk, ranging from alien abductions to divine intervention, wouldn't suffice. He needed an expert. Later that day, Elliot made his way to the Glenwood Observatory, where Dr. Clara Reyes, an esteemed geophysicist, was conducting a long-term study on seismic activity in the region. Clara was known for her no-nonsense approach to science, and if anyone could help him make sense of this, it was her. When he arrived at the observatory, Clara was already busy analyzing data, her brow furrowed in concentration. The walls of her lab were covered in charts, graphs, and satellite images. Elliot explained what he had seen, showing her the photos and videos he had taken. Clara's reaction was one of measured curiosity rather than disbelief. "A lake doesn't just disappear," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Even if there were a geological cause, there would be evidence, displaced earth, runoff, seismic readings, but the data from last night shows nothing unusual, no tremors, no activity at all." "Then what could cause something like this?" Elliot asked. Clara hesitated, her scientific mind wrestling with the impossibility of the situation. "I need to see it for myself," she said finally. "Whatever happened, it's not natural. And if it's not natural, we need to find out what it is." The next morning, they set out together, heading for the crater that had once been Silver Lake. Clara brought a range of scientific instruments, geological scanners, thermal imaging cameras, and a drone to survey the area from above. As they approached the edge of the crater, Elliot noticed the same unsettling warmth he had felt the day before. Clara crouched down, taking a soil sample. She frowned as she analyzed it with a handheld scanner. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "The ground here is rich in minerals typically found in volcanic regions, But this area has never shown any signs of volcanic activity. And this heat, she trailed off, looking at Elliot. It's like the Earth was superheated, but there's no source. Elliot pointed to the center of the crater. What about there? Could something have fallen from the sky? Clara followed his gaze, her expression hardening. If something did, it left no trace visible to the naked eye. But maybe the drone can pick up something we can't see from here. As Clara launched the drone, Elliot scanned the horizon. A faint feeling of unease had been growing in him since they arrived. The silence was oppressive, the kind that seemed to swallow sound. When the drone feed appeared on Clara's tablet, both of them leaned in, watching the screen intently. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual, just the dry, cracked surface of the crater. But as the drone reached the center, the image distorted, static rippling across the screen. "That's not interference," Clara said, her voice low. "Something's disrupting the signal." The feed abruptly cut out, leaving only a black screen. Clara stared at the tablet, her fingers tightening around its edges. "Whatever's here," she said, "isn't from this world." Elliot's unease turned to dread. He looked out at the empty crater, and for the first time, he felt the weight of what might be waiting beneath the surface. The silence around the crater seemed to deepen as Elliot and Clara stood there, staring at the blank screen of the drone's feed. The air felt dense, as if the atmosphere itself resisted their presence. Clara's scientific curiosity burned brightly in her eyes, but Elliot's instincts screamed for him to leave. Something about this place felt wrong, profoundly, inescapably wrong. "We'll retrieve the drone," Clara said, breaking the silence. "It's expensive equipment, and the data it collected might still be salvageable." "You're sure that's a good idea?" Elliot asked, his voice tinged with unease. He glanced back at the crater, its depths a gaping maw of mystery. What if whatever caused the distortion is still there? Clara gave him a wry smile, though her expression was tight. "Elliot, science doesn't happen by running away from the unknown. We need answers, and answers require risk." Reluctantly, Elliot nodded. He followed her down the slope into the crater, the dry earth crunching beneath their boots. The temperature rose noticeably as they descended, beads of sweat forming on Elliot's forehead despite the cool morning air. Clara stopped periodically to take readings, her scanner emitting soft beeps and flashes of light. "The thermal readings are off the charts," she murmured. "The ground should have cooled by now, but it's holding steady at nearly 90 degrees Celsius." Elliot frowned. "That's almost boiling point. How can the soil sustain that without anything to heat it?" "That's what I intend to find out," Clara replied, her tone clipped but focused. As they neared the center of the crater, the strange sensations intensified. The air seemed heavier, denser, and the faint hum of static filled their ears, like the sound of an old television left on in another room. Elliot's steps faltered as an unnatural chill ran up his spine, despite the oppressive heat. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Clara paused, tilting her head. "Hear what?" "That hum. It's faint, but—" A sudden flash of light erupted from the center of the crater, bright enough to make Elliot shield his eyes. When he lowered his hand, he saw Clara staring, wide-eyed, at the spot where the drone had gone down. Something glimmered faintly in the sunlight, a strange, translucent object embedded in the earth. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, with a light that shifted through shades of blue, green, and violet. "What the hell is that?" Elliot whispered. Clara's voice was breathless, caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. "I've never seen anything like it. It almost looks organic." She moved closer, crouching beside the object. Her gloved hands hovered over it hesitantly before she pulled out a tool to take a sample. The moment the tool touched the object, a low, resonant sound filled the air, vibrating through the ground and into Elliot's bones. He stumbled back, clutching his ears. "Clara, stop!" he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sound, which grew louder and deeper, like the tolling of a massive bell. Clara froze, staring at the object as its light intensified. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence fell over the crater once more, but this time it was laden with tension. Clara stood slowly, her face pale but resolute. "Whatever this is," she said, "it's not natural. Not geological, not terrestrial. Terrestrial? Elliot repeated. You're saying you think this thing's alien? Clara hesitated, then nodded. The mineral composition is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's emitting energy at frequencies I can't even measure. And that reaction just now, it suggests some level of sentience or responsiveness. Elliot felt his stomach drop. He looked back at the object, now dimmer but still pulsing faintly. If it's alien, could it be dangerous? Clara frowned. Possibly, but danger and discovery often go hand in hand. Before Elliot could respond, a sudden gust of wind swept through the crater, carrying with it a faint whispering sound. The voices were indistinct, fragmented, but undeniably there. Elliot's pulse quickened as he looked around, but there was no one else in sight. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice trembling. Clara nodded, her brow furrowed. I did. The whispers grew louder, forming words that were chilling in their clarity. Leave this place. Elliot took an involuntary step back. Clara, I think we've overstayed our welcome. Clara hesitated, clearly torn between her scientific curiosity and the mounting evidence that something was very wrong. Finally, she sighed. You're right. We need to regroup, analyze the data we've collected, but we're coming back. Elliot wasn't so sure he wanted to, but he nodded, eager to leave the crater. As they climbed back up the slope, the whispers faded, replaced by the oppressive silence. The air seemed lighter once they reached the rim, and Elliot felt an immense sense of relief. Back at the observatory, Clara began analyzing the data from her instruments while Elliot paced the room. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day. The object, the sound, the whispers, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. This doesn't make sense, Clara muttered, staring at her screen. The energy readings around the object spiked right before the distortion. It's almost like it activated. Activated for what? Elliot asked. That's the question, Clara said. She glanced at him, her expression grave. Whatever this thing is, it's not just sitting there. It has a purpose. Elliot didn't like the sound of that. A purpose like what? Communicating? Observing? Or worse, Clara said quietly. We need to figure it out before it decides to show us. Elliot's unease deepened. He had come seeking answers, but now he wasn't sure he wanted to know the truth. All he knew was that the vanished lake was no geological anomaly. It was the beginning of something far bigger and far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The days that followed their initial investigation into the vanished lake were filled with an overwhelming sense of unease. Elliot couldn't shake the whispers he'd heard or the pulsing, alien light of the strange object in the crater. Every time he closed his eyes, the image replayed itself, vivid and unrelenting. Meanwhile, Clara was consumed by her research. The observatory became a fortress of analysis, charts, and theories, yet none of her findings brought comfort. Elliot had hoped Clara would abandon the project, but her determination only grew. I've sent the energy readings and mineral samples to colleagues at NASA and SETI, she told him one evening, the glow of her laptop illuminating her tired face. If this is extraterrestrial, we need more expertise. And if it's hostile? Elliot asked. Clara hesitated before replying. If it's hostile, we may already be too late. The ominous words hung in the air like a storm cloud. That night, Elliot barely slept, plagued by dreams of the lakebed opening up to reveal horrors that had lain dormant for millennia. The next morning, Clara burst into Elliot's house, her face pale but alive with urgency. We need to go back, now. Elliot sat up from his half-eaten breakfast, dread pooling in his stomach. Why? What happened? Satellite imaging picked up something new, she said, shoving a tablet in front of him. On the screen was a thermal map of the lakebed. At its center, the alien object glowed with intensity, but now there was something else, a web of heat patterns radiating outward, as if the object was spreading its influence across the crater. It's growing, Clara said. And whatever it's doing, it's accelerating. Elliot stared at the image. What if it's dangerous? Clara, we don't even know what we're dealing with. That's why we have to go, she said. If we don't, we'll never know until it's too late. Reluctantly, Elliot agreed. Within an hour, they were back at the edge of the crater, equipped with additional instruments, safety gear, and a renewed sense of trepidation. The heat was even more intense this time, and the strange hum from before was louder, more insistent, as if the crater itself had come alive. As they descended into the lake bed, Clara's scanner began to emit rapid beeps. She stopped and examined the readings, her brow furrowed. This isn't just energy, it's a signal. A signal? To what? Elliot asked. Clara adjusted the scanner, her fingers trembling. Not to what, to whom? Elliot's stomach dropped. You think it's trying to contact someone? Something? Before Clara could answer, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. They both stumbled, barely managing to stay upright as the crater seemed to pulse with life. The hum grew louder, and a beam of light shot out from the center of the crater, piercing the sky. The air filled with the same whispers Elliot had heard before, only now they were louder, more distinct. The time has come. We awaken, leave, or face the reckoning. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The words were in English this time, clear and direct. He grabbed Clara's arm. We need to get out of here. Clara shook her head, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. We can't leave now. We're on the verge of understanding something incredible. Before Elliot could argue, the light from the crater shifted, forming a dome of energy around them. It was as if the crater had sealed itself off from the outside world. Panic surged through him. What the hell is happening? He shouted. Clara stared at the energy field, her voice trembling. I think it's a defense mechanism. It knows we're here. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as the ground beneath them began to crack. From the center of the crater, the alien object began to rise, suspended in the air by the pulsating light. Its translucent surface shifted, revealing intricate patterns that looked like both circuitry and veins. Elliot felt his knees weaken. Clara, whatever this is, it's not friendly. Clara didn't respond. She was frozen, staring at the object as it emitted another burst of light. This time, the beam hit the ground in front of them, and a figure began to emerge from the dust and energy. It was humanoid, but its features were indistinct, as if it were made of the same shifting light as the object. The figure spoke, its voice resonating in their minds rather than their ears. You disturb the balance. This place is not for you. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. We mean no harm. We're trying to understand. The figure tilted its head as if considering her words. Understanding comes with a cost. The ground cracked further, and Elliot felt the heat intensify. He grabbed Clara's arm, his voice desperate. Clara, this isn't a conversation, it's a warning. We need to leave now. The figure's form began to shift, growing taller, its features more defined. Its eyes glowing with the same pulsing light fixed on Clara. The lake was taken to protect your kind. You have awakened what sleeps below. Leave or face annihilation. Elliot didn't wait for Clara to respond. He yanked her back toward the edge of the crater, his legs burning as he scrambled up the slope. The whispers turned to wails, the sound vibrating through his chest. The light grew brighter, and the ground began to collapse inward, as if the entire crater were folding in on itself. They reached the rim just as the dome of energy imploded, sending a shockwave that knocked them both to the ground. Elliot looked back in time to see the crater vanish, swallowed by a blinding light. When it faded, the lake was back, as pristine and undisturbed as it had always been. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara sat up, staring at the lake with wide, haunted eyes. It gave us a warning. Elliot shook his head, his voice hoarse. And we'd better listen. Some things aren't meant to be understood. They left Glenwood that night, and neither of them returned. The town remained quiet, the lake a tranquil mirror once more. But Elliot knew the truth, that beneath its surface, something ancient and unfathomable still lurked, waiting for the next disturbance. And next time, there might not be a warning.